And now we introduce our second keynote speaker. Thank you, Mary, for being with us today. It's an honor. Here is your bio. So Mary Bockhover received her PhD in philosophy from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is professor emerita at Cal Poly Humboldt, where she taught in the Department of Philosophy from 1989 until her retirement. Over the decades, she has taught a wide range of philosophy courses spanning the history of Western philosophy as well as the tradition of China and India. In recent years, her teaching included Asian philosophy, moral controversies, and the philosophy of sex and love. Oh my God. All general education courses designed with a practical learning component to demonstrate philosophy as a lived and applied discipline. Dr. Bockhover is also the editor of Rules, Rituals, and Responsibility, a volume published in honor of Professor Herbert Fingeret. She has also published extensively in journals, contributed book chapters, and written entries in academic references works. Her scholarly activity includes keynote and invited lectures around the world, including China, Czech Republic, England, Germany, Israel, Mexico, and Singapore, and across the United States. She was a Fulbright scholar in the Czech Republic and has frequently returned to teach philosophy at the University of Pardubice. Beyond the teaching and scholarship, Dr. Bockhover has served her university community and profession in many ways. She founded the Humboldt Philosophy Forum, which has hosted renowned speakers such as fortunately I didn't know, Peter Singer, Janet Mock, and Jennifer Boylan, Tarana Burke, and George Yancey, providing a public arena for the critical and constructive exchange of ideas on pressing contemporary issues. In addition, she has served as a biomedical ethics consultant and speaker since the beginning of her career. So it's an absolute honor to have you here, Mary. And today she's going to present on self and social roles as a chimera revisited. The floor is all yours. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Susie, for that long and far too complimentary introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and again, it's been just a wonderful opportunity for me to hear other people share their ideas and to have conversations that I would imagine people have been having for well, obviously a very long time. So not to belabor this, I'm going to go ahead and just read my paper, beginning with the abstract, because it had been unfortunately slightly misrepresented in the last place I had a paper published. So briefly, in Against Individualism, Henry Rosemont argues, and Henry's my teacher, or was, against a contemporary Western concept of self that takes rational autonomy to be core of what it means to be a person, and I'd say the core. Rational autonomy is thought to be the only essential feature of this core self, endowing us with an independent existence and moral framework to act accordingly as independent, rational, autonomous individuals. In marked contrast, and drawing from the Analects of Confucius, Rosemont defines personhood as consisting of social roles and their correlative responsibilities. We are persons relationally only in virtue of the roles and, sorry, I just lost my place. Consisting of social roles and the correlative responsibility, only in virtue of the roles that independently connect us to each other. Rosemont holds that the independent self is a chimera that leads to a problematic ethic where our connection to others is undermined instead of seen as central to who we are and how we should treat others. I argue that social roles are also chimeras that are constructed instead of metaphysically given. That is, while we are essentially social, how this plays out is variable and contingent. I also argue that we are essentially self-aware subjects or embodied selves whose experience is uniquely our own and inescapably filled with otherness. Both individualizing and socializing aspects of self are necessary, as well as interdependent. Moreover, favoring one over the other has both positive and negative consequences. Introduction. This article revisits and condenses an earlier work I wrote to commemorate my teacher and friend Henry Rosemont, who was a committed Confucian philosopher. Henry was not just a Confucian philosopher. He believed that the ideas found in the Analects were superior to Western views that define persons in individualistic instead of social terms. His belief that a Confucian view holds the key to solving many of the social problems we face today is reflected in the stated purpose of his last book, Against Individualism, a Confucian rethinking of the foundations of morality, politics, family, and religion. And I quote, I will first attempt to show that the view of human beings as most fundamentally free and rational, autonomous individual selves is almost certainly false, and more than that, mischievous. In celebration and defense of freedom comes at the expense of social justice and peace, end quote. In short, Henry did not believe that Western and Confucian views are beyond comparison, but to the contrary, that comparing them would lead us to see on rational grounds that the West has been misguided and that Confucian philosophy can remedy our ills. I will compare the Western individualistic view of self that Henry took to be false, mischievous, and worthy of being discarded altogether with the Confucian social view, arguing instead that personal identity consists of an irreducible unity of subjective experience and objective content. Without contradiction, the self can be thought of as entailing an embodied awareness that has both individualizing and socializing features that interdependently interact. Embodied awareness provides the medium for developing the roles and responsibilities we bear to each other. It is the subjective phenomenological ground for the formative social experiences that we have and out of which our unique personal identities are constructed. Both features are necessary to being a person, even in cultures that favor one feature over the other. Both Confucian and Western views of self also have positive and negative implications. And in both cases, the negative implications result from the self being conceived in a mutually exclusive manner, that is, as only in individualistic or social terms. 2, Rosemont's target, the Western individualistic concept of self. On the existence of the individual self and self-identity, chapter 3 of Henry's book, he sets up the West's general understanding of personal identity by saying, the idea of the individual self based on self-awareness that entails rationality is one of the most deeply rooted constructs in the history of Western intellectual history. From its origins in ancient Greece in the tripart nature of the soul through the Judeo-Christian unitary version thereof, it has played a major role in shaping our sense of who and what we are, and how, therefore, we ought to live our lives, interact with our fellows, and shape the institutions in which we live together. End quote. From Plato to contemporary times, the role of self-awareness and reason is clearly central in the history of Western philosophy. Kant represents Henry's main target, though, in defining us, in Henry's words, as, quote, fundamentally free and rational, autonomous individual selves, unquote. For Kant, a person is essentially self-legislating, which rests on the a priori capacity to reason and act autonomously or of one's own volition. Our individuality derives from our having these capacities in and of themselves, as opposed to being socially conferred on us by others. 3, concerning Rosemont's on the existence of the individual self and self-identity. As far as being a person is concerned, I think Henry was correct in claiming that there is no independent core self, but in the sense that there is no core self that can mean anything to us independent of how we conceive it. The significance attached to this core self will depend on how we conceive it, but it does not follow that what we are thinking about does not exist. We cannot know anything without thinking about the thing we are trying to know, and to that extent, that thing is a constructed concept. Henry saw such abstract metaphysical entities as at best questionable articles of faith and at worst bad ideas that have led people astray, even catastrophically. Henry never favored transcendental thinking, as one can tell from the wealth of his writings and presentations. His reference to the self as a chimera, an unreal, fanciful creature of the imagination that also has connotations of being ugly and grotesque, is very apt given his Confucian bent. For Henry, the metaphysical idea of self is not only no good, it leads to harm. He states this in Against Individualism. But if the individual self is a chimera, then moral and political theories based on it as a grounding concept may well be misconceived, and consequently, we may need some new or very old ideas of who and what we are, how we ought to live our lives, interact with our fellows, and shape the institutions in which we live together, something we've heard only briefly before. His solution to the West's misguided individualism was to adopt a very old Confucian view of who and what we are, where being a person means being a nexus of relationships and roles appropriate to them. The Confucian view of self has 2 main features. First, we are persons because of our relationships. One could not be a daughter without a parent, a mother without a child, a sibling without a sibling, a spouse without a spouse, and the like. In other words, our personhood is conferred upon us by others, rather than consisting of qualities that we have in and of ourselves. As such, we are not individuals, we are social beings. Second, as our relationships change over time, so do ourselves. The example I present here with love and gratitude is that I am a teacher of philosophy, in large part because of my teacher, Henry Rosemont Jr. I was Henry's student, trained in the discipline, and enriched as a person along the way. I became a teacher because Henry helped to teach me how to become one. And now I am a committed teacher to my students in turn. With Henry's passing, with the loss of my teacher, mentor, and friend, I had become a different person. But losing Henry does not mean that I lose the part of me that exists because of him. We are established as persons by the formative relations that meaningfully continue to impact and transform our lives. 4, my critique of Rosemont's exclusively social view of self or personal identity. I hold that there is no essential, unchanging individual self that exists in itself, independent of context and relatedness. But let me be clear what this means, because its practical nature, the self must develop, and does so because of the people and events that have given form to how we think and what we value. And as we have already discussed, the self cannot have any meaning that is free from interpretation, or that would make any moral sense without having its significance shaped by how we think and what we value. So while thinking and valuing are universal human capacities, how we think and what we value are both culture specific and meant to apply to a world populated with others. Our world is necessarily context dependent in resting on such culturally transmitted and socially directed values and beliefs. In a mainstream Western context, the belief in an individual self, conceived as rational and autonomous, is central to our vision of who we are and how we ought to act. But this is only a partial account of what personhood may entail. Henry took our roles to be real and the rational autonomous self to be a chimera. But let's look at this problem more closely. The core self, in principle, could consist of any number of things that we think are essential to personhood. First, if we think that rational autonomy is most important or essential, or that we are persons because of it, or in the extreme, because of it alone, then other features of our lives will be thought of as less defining, self-defining, or as not defining at all. Even in this case, this does not mean that our relationships with others will be less important to us. We can see every person as being a rational, autonomous agent in their own right and value them as much, if not more, than we value ourselves. Second, as an activity, how we reason and choose to navigate our way through the world is as dynamic as the social roles we embody. Whether we think of our core selves in terms of our capacity to think and freely choose, or in terms of our capacity to form meaningful relationships, both are reasonable, although I think only partial interpretations of what actually makes us persons. I believe our capacity for rational autonomous thought is fundamental to our personhood, but it is only part of a more comprehensive sense of subjectivity essential to how we understand and experience our experience as individuals. In this way, I agree with Henry's claim that the rational autonomous self is a concept. However, social roles are also concepts, or ways to think of ourselves as mothers, sisters, spouses, teachers, citizens, friends, etc. Others socialize us according to their roles, and many experiences we have because of these others end up being formative to our development as persons. That is, they are essential to our identity. As we continue to mature, our roles and their correlative responsibilities continue to establish who we are in relation to others. The capacity for such relatedness is essential to our identity as persons, as is the capacity for autonomous thought. Our capacity for autonomous thought and our capacity for embodying roles are uniquely and universally human, but these capacities individualize us or make us the particular persons that we become over the course of our lives, only in being put into practice. Having the capacities by themselves is not sufficient to establish who I am, or who you are, or who anybody is in their unique embodied personal mode. That is, the capacities are generically human, but they also have inherently formative powers meant to be put into practice. Before that, we are nothing more than generic persons with no distinctive personal identity at all. The interdependent self. The upshot of this is that some of the most important features of our world concern the people we are closest to, or who have been the most formative in our lives. The more the people and events are formative in our lives, the more essential they will be to establishing who we are as persons. Our individual consciousness is necessarily filled with otherness, with the people, places, things, perceptions, memories, desires, thoughts, emotions, etc., that make up the distinct phenomenological content of each person's experience. Moreover, the consciousness we embody gives each of us a sense of being a distinct subject of experience, but in a world with other such subjects. The self-consciousness uniquely embodied that interdependently links us to what it brings to our awareness. In short, the self is inescapably social, for we live in a world populated with the people and events that have shaped us to be who we have become. To sum up, we live in a world filled with otherness. The capacity for rational autonomy and the capacity for embodying roles are both necessary to establish personhood in general. But how each of us does this in the context of culture and in the course of our own lives is what individuates us. Moreover, we transform ourselves and the world we live in by putting these capacities into practice. In other words, self-construction is an interactive, dynamic process that is part of a larger world constructive process. For example, consider how the notion of being a member of a family, or having a gender as opposed to a sex, have changed over the years and across the globe. Also consider the personal and social impact that gender nonconforming or LGBTQ, etc. identities have had, as well as how they have changed and continue to do so. Here we see how rational autonomy and the embodiment of roles function interdependently. How we develop our roles and execute our responsibilities will be shaped by how we think, for example, about the roles themselves, and how we think will be shaped by the people and events that have been formative to our development. Autonomy, by its moral nature, has profound social applicability, with roles and social constructs that we can reasonably critique and even change. In a moral context, the pressure that individuals and groups bring to bear to accommodate their needs and interests is, in part, how culture is changed. When everything is going smoothly, or when complaints are few and changes occur in a spontaneous and harmonious manner, then all is well. This is Confucius's view of the good life. However, when something is identified as a social problem in need of change, the group of individuals holding that view will not agree that harmony is the best course of action if it serves to maintain the status quo. To the contrary, they may press for changing the or ritualized customs of their culture that help maintain social stability and privilege for a majority, but at the expense of a smaller or less powerful group. Without autonomy, members of a less powerful group would not be able to think for themselves, think critically, or see their interests as having intrinsic value, even when elements of the larger society do not see them that way. Rational autonomy allows us to have our own reasons for wanting things to change in a way that grounds the interests of people not equally protected by mainstream culture. Because of it, we can determine for ourselves how we want things to be, as well as how best to make that happen, even if this means challenging the mainstream embodied values and norms. Rational autonomy invests people with a critical moral capacity that must be put into practice to pursue its moral aim. In this way, the capacity for rational autonomous thought is essential to critical thinking and moral activity. The problem clarified. As Henry warned, we should be cautious of the pitfalls of having an overly individualistic view of self. But we should also be cautious of the problems with having an overly social view of self. The problem that this discussion has brought to our attention results from the fact that the West has had a long tradition of defining personhood in terms of generic capacities, ones that we all possess in and of themselves, such as rational autonomy, while China has had a long tradition of defining personhood in terms of actual roles and practices that persons embody. The main problem in both cases lies in conceiving a personal identity exclusively as either being a function of capacities or, used in the exclusive sense, as being a function of active processes these capacities made possible. Casting the matter in this way creates a false dichotomy where the capacities and practices essential to actually being a person are thought to be opposed to one another instead of as being mutually interactive. We have capacities in order for them to be put into practice, and we could do nothing at all without them. More specifically, our capacity for moral agency only functions in virtue of being activated. If not cultivated or put into practice, the innate formative power of personhood can bear no moral fruit. In effect, no person, or at least no good person, can develop at all. What might be a cost of giving moral priority to our capacity for rational autonomy? When it comes to identity formation, privileging such internal features of self may promote an inward focus on our own conscious experience, which may make us feel alienated and alone. In effect, our commitment to others as if they were a vital part of us may be undermined, which may in turn undermine our sense of connection to them and our sense of belonging in the world. Moreover, being conditioned to believe that the essence of one's self is one's own autonomy, where one's rational autonomy is the center of one's world, can lead to selfish preoccupation with one's own rights instead of the responsibilities we have for others. This was Henry's worry. What might be the cost of giving moral priority to Lee or the social roles and conventions for being a good person? Confucianism mainly requires that we embody our roles well, so we can help others to flourish in their socially prescribed roles too. But Confucianism lacks an explicit mechanism whereby we reflect on and critically evaluate the legitimacy of the roles themselves, including the ethic or normative structure that each implies. Indeed, some of the most liberating social movements have resulted from protests against the status quo of tradition. Again, consider civil rights movements in the United States for African Americans, indigenous people, women, and the LGBTQ community that have seriously challenged mainstream traditions foundational to the social harmony, and I'll put that in scare quotes, of one's era on the grounds that they did not value the innate capacities we all have as persons on an equal scale. For such conflict, a new idea of social harmony is created, one that demands greater respect and autonomy for these oppressed groups. And this is the final paragraph. To conclude, the cost of both mainstream, Western, and Confucian views of personhood increase the more extreme or exclusive they are. That is, where innate capacities and the activities they give rise to are conceived as being mutually opposed to one another instead of as being functioning interdependently. We can think of ourselves as rights-bearing and roles-bearing once we realize that the embodied awareness with which we develop an identity is essential to the identity we construct, and the identity we construct is essentially filled with social content. Our social lives provide the content out of which our identities are constructed, and embodied consciousness provides the medium through which they are constructed. Both embodied self and the world it brings to life are essential, interactive aspects of what it means to be a person. As for Henry's specific complaint, once we understand that rational autonomy and social roles are both socially constructed, or different ways to think about what it means to be a person with both positive and negative aspects, then we can see them as the pragmatic devices that they are, as ideas that we can use to further our interests, whatever we may conceive them to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. It was really a beautiful, important paper. The topic is so difficult. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I had a terribly dry mouth doing the whole thing.
Of course, hydrate yourself. It's a topic that somehow we touched upon when we were together. It's hard. I mean, I see some kind of line with the discussion that Joshua and Joshua were having with each other at the beginning. There's, I don't know, there's on one hand, this kind of responsibility in living life, in this ascension toward, I don't know, however you want to call it, God, the essence, a sense of unity. And at the same time, clearly, if you take away from you the others, the social, nothing is left, because what is left? So it's hard to. There's this scholar, Laura J. Nanni. She just wrote a book on the porosity of the self, which is a beautiful image to describe this notion that, yeah, in the Western thought it's too monolithic somehow, and it creates a society that is divided in individuals. I don't know. I don't know if I have a question. Your paper proposes solutions and directions. It's anyway, I just wanted to say thank you to bring up this problem and this set of reflections, because it's really hard. Yeah, here I'm reading Joshua. It is hard to be and find your authentic true self, especially throughout stages of life. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I was trying to do as far as what philosophy can do is philosophy can focus in on what its subject is, or what it's really trying to say, which means how is it defining things, and really the kind of, and again, this might be somewhat oversimplistic, but you have this Western notion of the individualized self as a rational autonomous agent. Well, that's going to apply to any rational autonomous agent, right? And that's sort of a, maybe a defining feature of who we are as persons, but it doesn't individualize us in any specific kind of way. So it really doesn't say anything in practice about who we are as persons, right? In our individualized lives, and I use that term because really the individualized life is then a socialized life. We have to have the interaction, and when self and other is presented, as it is often in the extreme, in a mutually exclusive way, those things are seen as inconsistent. Like it's either, internalized reality, or it is completely social and external. And this is the way I saw thinking happen for decades while I was studying, the whole kind of mutually exclusive understanding that Henry Rose represented so much in his discussion or critique, powerful critique against Western views of self. And he offered this Confucian view, which I saw as just an extreme in the other direction, right? It didn't really take into account the capacities that we have that would allow any of that to be relevant. And so I see it as more an interdependency, not an exclusive matter of opposition as far as what it is to be a self. So that's what philosophy can do, is we take these and sort of bring them together now that we do philosophy more globally, which is not that it's only been happening really richly in the last at least half century or so, in the same in the depth.
Magnus.
Oh, thank you, Mary, so much for that paper. That's great insights, and I want to connect sort of like also to what I was talking about a little bit. because that rational part that you're talking about, the rational individual self, that's sort of like a what in a sense the Western world strive towards, and I'm coming from the social and the psychological sciences, especially the psychological sciences, that's so much focus on the individual, and the individual is supposed to be rational, and the rational is supposed to overcome all the emotional stuff. That's sort of like that's the cognitive therapy, whatever, and how it's. But I was thinking about what I was writing about what Alfred Schutt was writing about the anonymity, anonymous way of sense of the rational individual, right? It's and also those other social roles that you have that also becomes anonym in the sense anonymous in that sense also. In contrast to the feeling of it's my experience, I have some sort of like ownership of it or agency that I can sense. It's almost like it's me, even if I have, even if I'm different now than I was 10 years ago, it's still me there, here, then, and sort of like the process, the experiential self of experiencing something. Still, it's kind of like an agency or ownership. It's my experience. I mean, in that sense, I don't know. It's just a comment. I don't know.
Well, I think that's really
yeah,
good. I mean, that's self,
yeah,
right? That sense of subjectivity, that sense of subjectivity
yeah,
is very real and
yeah,
absolutely vital to, I think, essential to defining who we are as persons. But it doesn't have content until that sense of self connects us through experience to others, to events, to a history, to a culture, to values, all of that stuff. And we can treat it in the abstract separately, but they work together to really form this larger and, I think, more accurate understanding or view of what it is to be a person. And, we also have a sense of otherness. I mean, you talked about intentionality and directedness. I mean, right, we're always kind of, we're not only aware, but we're aware of ourselves as having this kind of experience. And there's a direction to that. And what it's being directed at, what our self-consciousness, I will say, is being directed at, is our world, right? It's the content of our experience. And philosophically, the problem is that if you see the otherness, the social aspect, as not being as vital as that sense of subjectivity, then all the things that make you who you are in a very formative way become contingencies. In a way, well, yeah, I could have had another teacher than Henry or Herbert Fingerat, or I could have had other parents. No, I couldn't have had other parents. My parents, but put that aside for a minute. Lots of things that and they're not just kind of contingent. They're actually completely vital to defining who I am as a particular person in the world, as Mary Bockhover. And so I think the mutually exclusive way of understanding it actually is really problematic. And I think what philosophy can do is allow us to see that and bring it together in a way that sees what has been cast as being interdependent aspects as being vitally interdependent. If that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Other questions, comments, remarks?
May I make one more comment?
Please.
I'm talking too much. I always do this.
No, you don't.
You're not going to talk. You're not going to ask questions. But I just want to make one more comment. And I'm going back to the quote that Magnus had in his paper about the dog. Oh, I mean, I'm sorry. We're animal lovers. My daughter, she once said, I'll be real quick, but she once said that there was this question going around and said, if you could have a capacity to hear, to communicate with anything else, what would it be? And she said initially, because she loves animals, she said, non-human animals, right?
Mm.
And then she took it back swiftly, and she said, then I would hear their suffering. And one of the things I was thinking about is that this sense of otherness, a sense of interrelatedness, may not just be, well, I guess that would be part of the events, but just our tendency to underestimate or undervalue the lives and experiences of other non-living, non-human beings, I think runs the same sort of risk, where we don't see, like dogs as being able to have experiences, empathy that we may not have, because we're so prone to abstract, right? Abstract thinking, because we have this sense of self that always kind of gets in the way and needs validation. Maybe we've lost touch with that basic empathy, just to feel the pain and the happiness of other living things. And so this is completely independent of what I said in a way in my paper. But then when you were giving your presentation, I thought that maybe we should take a little bit more attention, pay a little bit more to where things like empathy, the virtues, Aristotle about this, come from. Desire, regulated. Well, maybe even more basically than that, for a dog, empathy is not regulated by reason, I would want to say. It's more basic than that. And it's absolutely vital to what it is to be good.
Yeah.
Lots of people would disagree.
Thanks.
I totally agree. Barpur here writes, I wonder if animals ever ask any philosophical question. That's a very good point. Yeah, who knows? I mean, yeah, Joshua.
Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off there, Dr.
No, go ahead.
Yes, actually, just a thought that I had since Dr. Englander's, and I think it's connected to Dr. Bockhover's paper too, is that yeah, there's a sense that we seek validation in the other. I was also wondering about the more darker side to that, where I think the other two would seek the destruction of it rather than the validation of one. And so I was wondering, in that sort of uh conflict, in what way that can that kind of like self-consciousness or recognition from the other in the midst of this the desire for like empathy to be recognized and this struggle could emerge like what uh how could that happen? Just throwing it out there.
Big question. Who wants to try an answer?
We should answer it, yeah.
Mary or Magnus?
Magnus, you want to give this a go?
Yeah, I can. I mean, the way I see empathy in the sense of, I don't see it as, I think the way I also presented it is like we have it as well as the dogs, whatever, in that sense, but we take it for granted. So we skip over it and we go directly to all the other, constructed whatever ideal types of the they, what I called that I followed Schutz there, the they orientation instead of the though orientation that's there in empathy, so to speak. But it's but in a sense it could be good in of seeing the other when that acknowledgement is there, right? To acknowledge the other. But you can also, in empathy, in the sense of understanding the other, also means that you can understand the other so as to know how to hurt them better. So, and that's awful to say that, but that's the way phenomenology defines empathy, is to be present to the other person's lived body as expressing something. So in that sense, it's nothing good about empathy, but empathy allows you to do something good in that sense. So the validation there is to, you know, the dog is ability to go from empathy to validation in that sense, and to follow the other, and it doesn't see those abstractions of the different theys or the different social roles and whatever, you know. I mean, it treats the guards the same way as the prisoners. I mean, in that sense, in the example. So it's but I would say that empathy would be, it's not like the everyday definition of empathy as in something, you know, like you know, try to walk in the other's shoes, because that's a different type of definition of empathy than you have in phenomenology, because phenomenology focuses on that you have to have had an experience to be able to feel sympathy or compassion or something, because you have to understood something. Otherwise, you could not have that. You know, I mean, something must come at you, some sort of meaning. You have to be present to something to be able to do something. So empathy is in that sense not anything for, I mean, that guarantees validation, but validation can follow in that sense. And what type of validation? I mean, what can also follow is the destruction of the other, right? Like you said, Joshua, like what's that's not like an opposite, but it's just what follows. I mean, so my point was sort of like that we have to start reflecting on empathy. And if we do, we can also take the next step of, you know, like compassion or sympathy and all those, the good things, so to speak, and follow that person instead of just take for granted whatever comes in our way as a social category or something else. So it's just basic, more like phonological social science in that sense than anything else. I don't know if I answered your question, but it was a reflection.
I think
Yeah, it's been a long day. It's Friday night here. Yeah.
Well, if I may, Joshua, that is a good question, and thank you for what you just said, Magnus. But really quickly, I think it's really important to see that empathy can be used for good or ill by our own standards. And one of the things that maybe it's just my experience of good dogs, right? I mean, dogs that I would call good, is that their empathy is reflected in this particular case by the dog's immediate experience of the other's pain. The other's pain. I mean, it's not just like they're dehumanized in some philosophical sense. I mean, they're hurting, and the dog is empathetic to, and I think experiencing that vicariously through, and that's what empathy can allow us to do. And then we can use empathy for good or ill based on that, and based on motives that we can conjure up self-reflectively or intentionally, that dogs I don't think do. You know, if a dog ends up being a bad dog, it's because it's being conditioned to respond to its environment in particular ways. And but I think the natural, and I don't want to go down arguments from nature here, but the impetus is really to be aware of the pleasures and pains of others in a way that allows for a kind of direct responsiveness that you don't get in the human situation as much. It's mediated for people with this self that we can become very protective of perhaps in a very, very pathological way.
Thank you.
All right. So I